during his time with Oasis, was Noel Gallagher a rubbish guitarist? I've heard and read many comments down through the years suggesting that he was. And I've also heard Noel himself be very self-deprecating about his own guitar skills in interviews. But this is a very broad question. When it comes to rhythm guitar, Noel Gallagher was an excellent guitarist. He had the knack of writing guitar parts that were instantly recognisable just by the chords and the way he strummed them. Whatever, Half the World Away and The Master Plan are excellent examples of this. The moment you hear any one of those intros, you immediately know exactly what song it is just from the chords and the rhythm playing alone. Not many artists can pull that off. But when people are critical of Noel Gallagher's guitar playing during his time in Oasis, they're usually not talking about his rhythm playing. They're usually talking about lead guitar. So that's what we're going to focus on today, Noel Gallagher's lead guitar style. Let's start out by looking at the three usual criticisms. Number 1. He only ever used the pentatonic scale, pretty much no matter what the chords underneath were doing. This is, generally speaking, true. Noel would write these really interesting chord sequences full of non-diatonic chords and often key changes as well. But when it came to playing lead guitar over the top, he tended to only ever use one single scale shape, to which he usually made 0 adjustments regardless of what the chords were doing. This is the pentatonic shape that Noel most usually used. I'll demo it for you now in G, E minor. A great example of this simple scale over complex chords principle is Married with Children. The chord sequence moves all over the place. It's incredibly creative, pulling in chords from other keys and doing all kinds of interesting stuff in the basic chord sequence. In the lead guitar part and guitar solo, however, Noel just barrels onwards as if there are no chords outside the basic 7. He never changes the scale once. And so, as you would expect, there are therefore multiple moments in that song where the lead guitar sounds a little bit dissonant and out of tune. But here's the thing about that. That weirdly became part of the Oasis sound. You could hear a complicated chord sequence like that with totally basic pentatonic lead guitar over the top and just know you were hearing Oasis before the vocals even started. Strangely, whether by design or accident, that became part of their signature sound. But there were nonetheless several moments where Noel used that scale shape he typically stuck to brilliant effect. Here's one standout moment. And here's another. But of course, only knowing one scale shape and not knowing how to adjust the notes in it to fit different chords meant that whatever he did on certain songs just didn't work. And I think that's at least part of the reason that a guest lead guitarist was so often brought in for the outro of Champagne Supernova. The chord sequence to the outro of that song goes like this: A, G, F sharp minor, and then a bar of F and then G. Now, to solo over that in a way that makes musical sense on paper, you would be in A major for the first bar. For the second bar, you would still be in A major, but you would have to flatten note 7. For the third bar, you'd be back to just normal A major again, and on the fourth bar, you would be in A minor. Paul Weller didn't even get those changes quite right on his solo. Neither did John Squire at Nebworth. The only guest lead guitarist who I reckon got it pretty much bang on was Johnny Marr. So now let's move on to criticism number 2, excessive repetition. Another frequent criticism of Noel Gallagher's lead guitar playing in the 90s is that it was just too repetitive, often playing the same phrase over and over and over. And once again, that is true. The solo from Listen Up is a great example. For a while, Noel Gallagher did this on every song. He does it constantly in the background of Whatever. He does it constantly in the background of Champagne Supernova. And there's a B-side called It's Better People, where the backing lead guitar is literally nothing else. But here's the confusing thing about that. We know from songs like Live Forever, Don't Look Back in Anger, Magic Pie, It's Getting Better Man, that Noel was capable of playing really well-crafted, complex and interesting lead guitar solos. On other songs like Stay Young, for example, he plays really interesting melodic guitar parts pretty much from start to finish of the whole song. It's almost just one long solo. So what was going on in songs like Listen Up? Why, when he was capable of writing and performing really musically interesting stuff, did he so often choose to keep things so simple? This brings us nicely on to the third and final criticism: excessive simplicity. And once again, this also is true. Noel Gallagher did have a thing for writing very complex songs, but keeping the arrangements and the lead parts very, very simple. For example, have a listen to the keyboard solo on Talk Tonight. It is literally just the same two notes over and over again. So we know Noel Gallagher could do brilliant showy stuff on the lead guitar, but I think he often didn't do that as an intentional, conscious choice. Particularly in the 90s, Oasis modelled themselves on the Beatles, and you can see the massive similarities in basic principle between how both bands approached their music. Complex, interesting chord sequences and melodies with pretty simplistic accompaniment. Just listen to Mother Nature's Son or Blackbird. The Beatles had no problem just letting the song speak for itself. And George Harrison, their lead guitarist, used a ton of space and simplicity in his playing, sometimes just adding the odd simple little lick in between Lennon and McCartney's vocal. I reckon it's at least possible that the conscious choice to tone things down and keep things simple, lead guitar wise, could at least have been partly Beatles inspired. And this does seem to be the case, because when Gem came on board, who can absolutely shred, the lead guitar lines were still kept simple. So, we've looked at the three main criticisms and seen that all of them do have some validity. But here's what I reckon in response to them. First up, Noel only knew one scale shape. I think that's true. I think he did. But I also think that became part of the Oasis sound, and as the band went forward and he learned more about music, I think he actually intentionally stuck to that because it was just part of the signature sound. And there's multiple examples of him within that scale shape doing some really effective and interesting stuff. Criticism number 2, excessive repetition. On songs like Columbia, Listen Up, Bring It On Down, I think that repetition was actually intentional as well. I think Noel approached songs in a slightly different way to many other musicians of that era. He was always on some level into grooves and into creating a hypnotic looping thing that just goes round and round and sort of puts the listener into a bit of a trance. Look at the outro to I Am the Walrus, for example, or Rock and Roll Star, where he just uses white noise to do the exact same thing. I think Noel wasn't playing complex lead guitar on these songs because that wasn't the point. The point was the texture and vibe of the song, not playing a complex solo. And that seems plain because when he wanted to do a complicated solo, he could. And the third criticism, excessive simplicity. You have to remember that the Britpop movement in the 90s came right after the prog movement of the 70s and the hair metal movement of the 80s. The world had just had 2 decades of flashy guitar whittle, and with people like Van Halen, Steve Vai and Nuno Bettencourt in the 80s, there wasn't really anywhere left to go anyway when it came to extreme guitar pyrotechnics. In fact, at this period in time in the UK, high-speed guitar noodling had actually become really passé. Many people already know the famous story that when Live Forever was being mixed, producer Owen Morris literally just removed the entire guitar solo because he thought it sounded like Slash. That drive for simplicity in the early days of Britpop was in fact an effort to not be associated with the hair metal sound that had now become cringy and uncool. So, was Noel Gallagher a rubbish guitarist? Or was Noel Gallagher a guitar genius? He was definitely very good when he chose to cut loose. He certainly wasn't a guitar genius in the same vein as Eric Clapton or Jimi Hendrix, but I think he had a flair of genius on the guitar that expressed itself in a different way. While Clapton and Hendrix were blues masters who could improvise incredible stuff on the spot, Noel Gallagher's genius came more in the studio and was more in the art of layering. A journalist once referred to him as the new Phil Spector, and I seem to remember Noel taking that as a massive compliment. Phil Spector was the producer behind Let It Be by the Beatles and also several of John Lennon's solo records. He was known for his wall of sound approach to music, in which he would build layer upon layer of sound to create an incredibly dense and hard-hitting texture in which you could often hear something new every time you listened. Noel Gallagher approached the guitar in a very similar way in the studio. For example, if you look at Morning Glory, the song, the texture of it is built up out of countless different lead guitar riffs, all laid on top of each other, filling in the gaps, and creating the wall of sound. Famously, producer Owen Morris, once again, when he was mixing Columbia, asked Noel Gallagher which is the correct lead guitar track. There's dozens here, which one am I supposed to be using? And Noel just replied, all of them. This principle was pushed to its limits on Be Here Now, where the whole band attempted to record 96 studio layers for literally every song on the record. Part of what made Oasis so incredibly effective and successful in the 90s was not just that they had great songs, but that they had a particularly unique signature sound. And Noel Gallagher's left field approach to piling up guitar parts, licks and riffs in the studio was definitely a huge part of that. Of course, he would sometimes play complicated lead guitar stuff, but the real artistry of Noel Gallagher's sound was in the layering. It was far more about that wall of sound, building up incredible textures, grooves and moments, not through high-speed noodling, but through the patient layering up of simple guitar part upon simple guitar part. So, as you've probably gathered by now, I do not think Noel Gallagher was a rubbish guitarist. I just think he was a different guitarist. He was focused much less on soloing and much more on creating something unique and magical in the texture and tone of the song itself. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you next time.